our veteran members, and especially newcomers. We always get a nice sort of group of new people who are checking us out, and I hope your first visit is not your last. We're a warm community, and it's my hope that you get to know us and get to like us, and maybe even one day become one of us. What I want to do this morning, I'm sort of going to beg your indulgence a bit. I want to deal with an issue that is prevailingly philosophical, but and a little bit technical, but also has tremendous practical ramifications. And you know, I'm a lifelong humanist. I'm a secular person. I don't believe in a supreme being, but as Susan indicated in my brief biography, I've been a student of religion, and I take the questions that religion poses very seriously, and I've always been fascinated by them. And in some ways, the talk this morning brings together those two sort of parts of my life. Very often, I'll give away a secret, a lot of the inspiration for a lot of my addresses on Sunday morning are really more autobiographical than they seem, in the sense that it's my working through issues that I myself find problematic and that I'm struggling with. And I use the creation of the platform address as a vehicle by which to work through some of those issues and hopefully come to some sort of at least tentative resolution of those issues that I'm basically struggling with. And this is an issue that I long struggle with as a person who is both secular and yet takes some of the categories of religion, or the religions, some religions, in their best sense. Takes them seriously. So my talk this morning is entitled Is Nothing Sacred or Is Anything Sacred? It boils down to the same thing. Let me begin as follows. When I was doing my graduate work at Columbia University many years ago, one of my most esteemed professors and mentors was Cornel West, whom I'm sure is known to you. Cornel was really great. I got to know him personally, and I should say, I mean, I'm still sort of riding high on this. He was, for my second master's, I had to put together a little orals committee, and he was on my orals committee, and he really loved my master's thesis, and he was very complimentary. And he had once referred to me, I invited him here, after the Pinel riot. If you come from Teaneck and you've been around a long time like Laura, remember we had a bona fide riot in 1990. I invited Cornel West to come here to give a talk to a large multiracial group, because no one I thought could speak across racial lines better than Cornel West could. And we had a dinner for him here and so on. And there's a photograph with me and him here, and darn it, I can't find it. I don't know where it is. It's somewhere in a box somewhere. But he was somebody I admired. When he was my instructor, he was only 24 years old. And yet, even then, I knew he was demonstrably brilliant, and I correctly predicted that he was destined for an acclaimed public career. Not only was Cornel extraordinarily well-read, he was also an electrifying lecturer, and his intellectual delivery was enriched by powerful moral convictions. West has spoken and written prolifically about the breakdown of moral values in our consumer-driven culture, wherein the lust for material possessions supersedes our commitment to the welfare of human beings. He would often proclaim society's need to put in the forefront and to strengthen what he referred to as non-market values, the most prominent of which he identified as love, compassion, and service to others. To this trio of non-market values, I would add respect for human dignity, which is the centerpiece of ethical culture. When we say non-market values, we talk about things that are not commodities, that you can't buy and sell. Okay, friendship is a non-market value, love is a non-market value, human dignity is a non-market value. Indeed, ethical culture was born out of the matrix of the oppression of market-driven values in the heyday of the Industrial Revolution, when men, women, and children toiled in oppressive and unsafe factories, poor immigrants were herded into substandard tenements, children went unschooled, minorities marginalized, invisible, and degraded, as a matter of course, while robber barons grew phenomenally wealthy on the backs of those whom they exploited. It was these conditions, expressions of the crushing power of the market, that ethical culture sought to answer by proclaiming and putting into practice the non-market value of the dignity of men, women, and children as its guiding ideal and source of inspiration. Another way to express this is that in that age, in fact in any age, human life and human dignity are too often devalued and degraded. And ethical culture proclaims that you and I and every human being on the face of the earth is precious, and should never be held cheaply by other persons or by society as a whole. It was these social and economic forces that gave rise to ethical culture. But there were intellectual and philosophical dynamics that brought ethical culture into existence as well. And the most powerful of these dynamics was the rise of science and its relationship to religion in the 19th century. There was no century in the modern era in which science was held more prestige among educated people than in the 19th century. As science gained in its power to explain natural phenomena, it saw itself at war with religion. Archaeological and literary research compellingly demonstrated that the books of the Bible were not created in the order in which they appear in the biblical canon, leading to the conclusion that they were not of divine origin, but were written by human beings at identifiable periods in the past. But most importantly, science radically challenged biblical accounts of the natural world. Geological findings demonstrated that the Earth, in fact, was extremely old and not created in 6 days, as Genesis indicates. Literal readings of the Bible were no longer credible under the challenge of scientific explanation. The regularity of scientific laws made belief in miracles no longer possible. In the face of scientific explanation, God retreated to the corners until some theologians appropriated a position of what was referred to as, quote, the God of the gaps, okay? In other words, God would be invoked to explain those phenomena which science could not or could not yet explain, which when one reflects on it, is a pretty pathetic and diminished role for the almighty creator of the universe to play, right? To be relegated to the corners as science pushes it right further. That was a theological position that clearly was defensive by theologians in the 19th century. Let me just say something else historically that's very interesting. All the big colleges in America, including Columbia where I teach, were founded by churches, right? They were Protestant churches. The first not to, this is interesting for the history of ethical culture, the first major university in the United States which was not founded by a religious order. Does anyone know which one it is? It's Cornell. Cornell was founded as a land-grant college, and it still has an excellent educational school. And as a result, it was the first college in America that gave an academic position to Felix Adler and to teach at a major college because it was not grounded in a Protestant sect. Very, very interesting. In fact, the first president of Cornell, Andrew White, was a non-believer and wrote a 2-part volume. I have the book, I've actually read some of it, in the 19th century called The War Between Theology and Science. And clearly he took the position of science in its war against religion and theology. So Cornell has an interesting history in terms of the sort of secularization of the American university. Anyway, that's a side point. Other religious thinkers of a more religious bent tried to hitch their theological beliefs to the authority of science. I mean, if you could prove something by the light of science, you gained a lot of vigor, a lot of strength to your argument, okay? The culmination of this marriage became known as, quote, natural theology. In short, the regularities discovered by science, distilled into natural laws, provided, so they thought, validation for God's existence and God's intelligence, indeed God's design, which lay behind an animated nature. In short, cashing in on its authority, science created an army of religious thinkers to shore up belief in a divine being that stands and guides the cosmos. God, in other words, was a grand architect and designer, and the universe was the product of his intelligent design. In other words, science was used to prove the existence and validate the existence of an intelligent designer behind it all. But this strategy of hitching religious truth to the prestige of scientific authority met an insurmountable obstacle in 1859 with the publication of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. Darwin drove religious people crazy, okay? And he still does, in many ways. Why so? What Darwin had shown with extraordinary explanatory power was how species evolved one into the other by virtue of natural forces alone, without any input from outside the system of nature. In other words, for species to have evolved, God was totally unnecessary. Natural forces unaided by divine agency were sufficient. Okay. The implications of Darwinian evolution were clear and radical and devastating to the traditional religious mind. For what Darwin had shown was that the human species itself, the human species, evolved from previous forms of life and we are not the object of divine creation. The religious understanding had been, since time immemorial, that because man was created by God, he has a special and unique place in the scheme of things, in the scheme of nature. By contrast, what Darwinism proclaims is that man is merely a product of nature, comprised of nothing but atoms and molecules and protoplasm, and governed by chemical and biological forces in principle and substance, no different from the worm, the mollusk, or whatever slimy or unlovely creature your imagination can conjure up. Okay? As Spinoza had said 2 centuries before, man does not live in a kingdom within a kingdom, but is part of the kingdom of nature. We are not differentiated. We are not a special kingdom. We are simply part of the seamless kingdom of nature. In other words, with Darwinism, the human species is dethroned from a place of uniqueness, distinctiveness, and privilege. But most devastating to the religious mind is that Darwinism robs human beings of a possession of a soul. It says that at the beginning of Genesis, 2nd verse, that man is created Tselem Elohim in Hebrew, which means in the image of God. Man is not God, but man nevertheless possesses an attribute that is a reflection of the divine, whatever that may be, and this makes the human being special and unique in all of nature and differentiates us from the lectern, the mountain, the mosquito, and all other things. To the religious mind, the human being is comprised of 2 separate substances, a material body, which dies at the end of life, and a soul, which is made of spirit, is incorporeal, and is eternal. And the soul temporarily resides in our bodies, okay? And it is the possession of the soul, which again is a little bit of the divine in us, that makes the human being, unlike anything else, sacred. The sacred broadly means something with a special status that is separated from the rest. When you step into a church, you walk into separate space apart from the secular or profane world. When an observant Jew keeps the Sabbath, he or she occupies a sacred time, separated from profane time, which characterizes the regular workaday 6 days of the week. Some thinkers, such as the late historian of religion Mircea Eliade, believe that this tendency to divide space and time into sacred and profane realities, in fact, is deeply rooted in the human psyche and is a mode of consciousness virtually snuffed out, buried under the pressures of modern life. Okay, but he thought it was actually, Eliade was a famous historian of religion in Chicago, felt that it's actually inherent in human consciousness to divide the world into these 2 separate categories, the sacred and the profane. But returning to human beings, the fact that we are sacred has in principle monumental ethical implications. The fact that we are sacred means that we should not be desecrated, that human beings should not be violated, abused, enslaved, demeaned, humiliated, murdered, or oppressed. In other words, the possession of a soul in principle gives us protection from such violation. But remove the soul from the human being, and the question can then be asked, why should we treat human beings with greater regard or protection than we do the cockroach, the rat, the virus, or anything else we discard or destroy if and when it does not serve our interest? You understand what's at stake here? Okay, in principle, right, the existence of soul. Darwin troubled the religious and moral mind then, and he still does. It also, to be honest, troubled the mind of ethical culture's founder, Felix Adler. Adler came from a religious background and took religion seriously. Adler was also, on the other hand, a modern whose own thinking affirmed the scientific worldview, and it was for this reason that he disavowed belief in a supernatural God, in miracles, and the doctrines and practices of the traditional religions. Adler had clearly stated that a person who disavows the deliverances of science is simply a fool. Okay, he embraced, as we do, the scientific worldview. By rejecting traditional religion, Adler also rejected the traditional notion of a soul that religion had endowed man with. But he also recognized that science could not provide for that either, reducing the human being again to nothing but molecules in motion that deserves no special protection from the abuse and violation of others. And so Adler made it the centerpiece of his lifelong intellectual quest to try to prove philosophically that human beings possess an invisible attribute that we refer to as dignity, which is the secular equivalent of sacredness. Sacredness is the religious analog to dignity, which is a secular term. Sacred is the same thing, but in religious vocabulary and with theological principles behind it. He accomplished this task to his own satisfaction, and frankly to no one else's in his community of philosophers, by employing a highly creative, complex, and nuanced development of Kantian philosophy, which frankly is too technical and beside the point to get into now. But he tried to prove that human beings have, without reference to traditional religious categories, actually possess dignity, or in effect, in that sense, are sacred, which would hold human beings safe from, in principle, from violation, and so forth. But the centerpiece of my address this morning is to explore precisely the question which plagued thinkers then, and still does, I argue, it plagues me, I'm disturbed by this, in our modern scientific age, when the traditional theological responses don't seem to satisfy anymore, and certainly among a growing segment of the population, which is increasingly disenchanted with conventional religions. I mean, 35% of millennials these days do claim to have no religion, which means they don't go to church. They may be spiritual in some sense, but they probably do not adhere to conventional monotheistic doctrines and so on and so forth, whatever their own freelance religious views or spiritual views may be. It's a growing segment. The question again is, in a world which is dominated by the juggernauts of corporate capitalism and its associated materialism and consumerism, of technology that structures our lives, in a world in which racism, sexism, growth, wealth inequality persists, and beyond these aspects of American life, a world in which people are killed wholesale by war, in which torture remains an international plague, and uncountable masses are exterminated in genocides and other mass atrocity crimes, how do we ensure that the human being is not held cheaply? It's just too easy to eliminate human beings, to eradicate them as if they were vermin or a disease or insects or a pestilence we have to get rid of. I mean, I still do not understand the psychology of genocide, which is, for me, just boggles the moral mind, how human beings can be so wantonly cruel and blind to the sacredness of fellow human beings, to their dignity, to their right to be here. How do we ensure that human dignity is upheld, respected, and reverenced? In other words, is it possible to defend the reality that the human person is sacred? But the deeper question that underlies this, and I want to ask, is whether for those of us who do not believe in a supreme being, for those of us who identify ourselves as secular, does it make any sense to uphold the notion of anything, and especially human beings, as being sacred, and thus in principle rendered precious and free from violation and abuse? In other words, can there be, this is the crux, the nux of my question, my platform, can there be a secular notion of the sacred, or is such an idea simply incoherent? If you're traditionally religious and you believe in God that endows man with his sacredness because we are created in the divine image, then the problem is resolved. But if you basically do not believe in that supernatural reality and agency, does it make any sense to talk about the human being as sacred? And can we, therefore, underlying question is, can we intellectually, philosophically construct an idea of the sacredness of the person out of a secular reality? Am I being clear as to what the problem? I'm trying to be as clear about what the problem is, right? I should say that trying to create a sense of the sacred out of the secular realm, as I've indicated, is a question that personally fascinates me, but I have to admit it is a very difficult problem to grapple with and ultimately solve. But having set up this problem, let me provide three possible responses to the origins of sacredness. Let me begin with what I've already presented. The standard religious position is that something, and here we're talking about human beings primarily, is sacred because there is a sacred realm occupied by God which endows human beings with sacredness. For the traditional religious believer, reality is twofold. There's the reality of space and time, the natural realm that we human beings occupy and which we perceive through our five senses. In this realm, everything is in flux. Things are born, age, change, decay, and die. In the world we inhabit, things are imperfect and they're constantly changing. Everything is, Heraclitus said, pantare in Greek. Everything flows, everything changes. But outside and above this realm, there is a second realm or reality that transcends the realm of nature. In Latin, it is supranatural, supernatural, above or outside of nature. We can call this realm the transcendent, the cosmic, the divine. It is the realm comprised by God. What are some of the attributes of this transcendent realm? As stated, it is beyond the normal reach of our experience and our senses. But it is also absolute, perfect, eternal, which can mean that it is timeless, outside of time, and it does not change. It is deathless and changeless. Post-Darwin, one of the arguments against evolution from the theological camp was, and this is a side point, was that God created each species in a way that is fixed as it is in accordance with the changelessness and perfection of God, and the morphing of one species into another was therefore a violation of the divine plan. In other words, God created each species, what was referred to in the 19th century as each kind of being as it is, and it doesn't change into another kind of being. Why? Because God is changeless and his creation reflects that changelessness. So the idea of evolution, which indicates the change or the morphing of one species to another, runs against the whole notion of God's reality and, by extension, his creation, the divine plan. So what this adds up to is that in order for human beings to be sacred, one must believe that we are tagged in some way to a cosmic divine realm separate from the natural or profane realm, which is imperfect and in which all things change. In briefest terms, if human beings are sacred, it can only be because God has endowed us with a soul, which is a small piece of this transcendent, eternal, cosmic reality that resides in us while we live. In short, if we humans are sacred, it can only be because God made us so. Remember that the strength of this position is that at first glance and in principle, it provides us with a defense against abuse and violation, which is essentially absent if we do not acknowledge a cosmic order which endows us with a sacred attribute. If person A threatens to murder person B, and person B says, "Please do not murder me," and person B asks, "Why should I not?" Person A asks, "Why should I not murder you?" Okay. And if person A threatens to murder person B, and person B says, "Please do not murder me," and person B asks, "Why should I not murder you?" Person A asks, "Why should I not murder you?" Person B, got it right now, person B might respond by saying, "Do not murder me because I am a child of God. I am a sacred and holy thing that we do not dispense with because it may satisfy your interest or anyone's interest to do so." Let's call this model of sacredness in the hard sense. Okay, sacredness in the hard sense. But the perplexing question again is it possible to have a notion of the sacred if we deny the existence of a transcendent, cosmic, eternal, divine order? In other words, does it make any sense for an agnostic, atheist, naturalist, or otherwise secular person to have a concept of the sacred which will serve the same purpose that it serves for the traditionally religious person? That's the question I'm asking. I must admit that I am personally drawn to the idea, and I sometimes fall back on the use of sacred language, and I suspect that some of you here might occasionally do so as well. I am prone to invoke such phrases as our sacred duty, or it's our sacred honor to do such and such and such and such. When criminals and con men swindle vulnerable people of their life savings without a shred of conscience, or in the human rights field, read of human beings subject to unspeakable torture to satisfy the power-hungry needs of tyrants, or thousands summarily destroyed like insects in acts of genocidal slaughter, or learn of innocent children writhing in agony, having just been attacked by poison gas, or seeing crying and horrified children ripped from their mothers' arms at our southern borders, Out of my despair, I am prone to ask, God damn it, is nothing sacred? Implying that something sacred has been violated. In the deepest recesses of my heart, I feel that something profound beyond the ordinary has happened that should never happen, and I reach for the idea of the sacred to give expression to the depth of my horror. But is there any warrant for me, a secular person, to invoke the concept of the sacred? In other words, as previously asked, is it possible to have a notion of sacred if you do not believe in a divine being outside of nature who endows us human beings with a sacred attribute, if we do not see ourselves or others as the children of God? Some secular thinkers have thought so, and have endeavored to create a sense of the sacred in the absence of God. Okay. One such thinker who has done so, and whose thinking I want to draw on, is the eminent late legal theorist Ronald Dworkin, okay, who taught law for many years at NYU Law School. He was very well known as a highly creative and influential legal thinker. He defends his view of the sacred in his book entitled Life's Dominion, a copy of which I have here, which I used, which is devoted primarily to his thinking on such life and death issues as abortion and euthanasia. And he has a whole chapter defending a secular understanding of the sacred. Okay, that's what I want to make use of. In this book, Ronald Dworkin says, quote, "The nerve of the sacred lies in the value we attach to a process," and process is the important word, "to a process or enterprise or project, rather than to its results considered independently from how they were produced." For Dworkin, the sacredness of human beings for people like us is rooted in two basic facts about human beings. First, he claims, every human being is the highest product of natural creation. The idea that human beings are special among natural creations is offered by Dworkin to explain why it is horrible that even a single human individual life should be extinguished. Second, each developed human being, he says, is the product not just of natural creation, but also of the kind of deliberative human creative force that we honor in honoring art. It's a very interesting analogy he makes. The idea is that each individual human life is inviolable and is therefore rooted in two combined and intersecting bases of the sacred, both natural and human creation. Then Dworkin goes on to say, to clarify this because it gets a little bit thick, he says, "The life of a single human organism commands respect and protection, no matter in what form or shape, because," and this is the operative term, "the complex creative investment it represents, and because of our wonder at the processes that produce new lives from old ones, at the processes of nature and community and language through which a human being will come to absorb and continue hundreds of generations of cultures and forms of life and value, and finally, when mental life has begun and flourishes, at the process of internal personal creation and judgment by which a person will make and remake himself, a mysterious, inescapable process in which we each participate, and which is therefore the most powerful source of empathy and communion we have with every other creature who faces the same frightening challenge. The horror we feel in the willful destruction of human life reflects our shared, inarticulate sense of the intrinsic importance of each of these dimensions of investment." Okay, end quote. What does that mean? In summary, according to Ronald Dworkin, even if the world is a process bereft of ultimate meaning, every human life is nonetheless sacred because, quote, "each human being," he says, "is a creative masterpiece of natural and human creation." So for Ronald Dworkin, it is the extraordinary creative process that goes into creating the human being, both natural and social, that makes the product of that process sacred, and according to him, renders and reveals the human being's intrinsic value. And the extent of the investment relates to the value we assess the human being as having. This is why, he notes, the death of an adolescent girl or boy is usually felt to be more tragic than the death of an infant who dies shortly after birth. The investment made in creating the adolescent, so to speak, is far greater than that of the infant. And the degree of life frustrated, so to speak, in the death of the teenager makes the death feel weightier. Well, I find Dworkin's effort to create a sense of the sacred out of the secular very intriguing. I have often felt that the explanatory complexity, personally, that goes into the creation of life commands respect from me and provides compelling reasons to reverence life, especially those of our fellow human beings. And given that Dworkin's view recognizes not only the natural processes and investments that bring us into being, but also the human ones, creates a range of flexibility in how to think about the sacred. So he argues, and this becomes a little naughty, he argues that if a teenager becomes pregnant and plans to have an abortion, conservatives might give greater weight to the natural processes that go into creating the embryo, whereas liberals, he said, would tend to give more weight to the life of the young woman and her life frustrations, how she would be frustrated with regard to fulfillment of life. In regard to bearing a child she is ill-equipped to care for, when, again, compared to the life investments of the early fetus. Unless one is a religious absolutist forbidding abortion in all cases, which Dworkin claims very few people are, most even people, most Catholics have abortions in rates that are higher than Protestants and others in American society, right? Very few people actually take an absolutist position. So if indeed you're not an absolutist about it, and you would allow abortion in cases of rape or mass deformity, major deformity of the fetus, then you're on a scale, a continuum. And he's trying to create a way to think about that scale in terms of investment in life, frustration to life, in effect, one way or the other, and so on. But what stands behind it, again, is a sense of the sacred, because the human being is, again, a masterpiece in the way in which an artistic creation is a masterpiece. But whatever the merits and subtleties of Dworkin's thinking, and they go far beyond this brief summary, they're not without their problems, and Dworkin certainly has its critics. And his approach is most likely not going to go very far with people who believe in God and hold to the conventional idea of the sacred as requiring an endowment emanating from the divine realm. Okay. One such critic is a religious thinker by the name of Michael Perry, who has written quite a bit in the human rights field and contends that Dworkin really doesn't understand the concept of the sacred at all. He does accept that Dworkin sustains a notion of the sacred in what he calls the soft sense, but not in a hard sense that gives the idea the heavy lifting that we want for it. When we say that something such as a human being is sacred, Perry contends we are making a claim about the way reality is really put together. We are making a claim that the sacredness of the person is both an objective and intrinsic attribute of the person. But Dworkin's formulation cannot do this, he says, because his idea of the sacred, no matter how finely he spins it, still remains lodged in the realm of the subjective. Okay, it's not objective, it's subjective. If we say that the human being is a natural and human masterpiece, and we revere it as sacred, as we revere great art, this reverent appreciation is still ultimately, Perry would argue, and it's hard to refute this, is still ultimately a product of the subjective evaluations of the person doing the evaluating. I suspect that the people in this room would shudder if we witnessed someone taking a knife to the Mona Lisa and shredding it, okay? We might even feel that something worthy of great respect and honor has been, quote, desecrated. Something sacred that's desecrated. When you look at the creative process that went in creating an artistic masterpiece, to destroy it summarily is a desecration, is to basically treat something sacred as expendable, and we would shudder at that, right? It is a masterpiece. But to someone who comes from a totally foreign, non-Western culture, they may find that the Mona Lisa to him or her has little value, okay? And its destruction is no big deal. In other words, we construe the human being and so on. Now, Dworkin might argue, and I suspect he would argue, is that even though a person from another culture doesn't recognize or evaluate the Mona Lisa very highly, if you sat down and explained to him at great length, him or her, the incredible creativity that went into its creation, they might, in effect, understand that this is not something that we should indeed violate. So that might be the counter answer. But this is, again, I think a very, very interesting debate. Okay. All right. So when this subjectivity is applied to the sacredness of the human being, Michael Perry says the following. The premise that every human being is sacred in a subjective sense cannot begin to bear the weight of the premise that every human being is sacred in the objective sense. Imagine someone saying to a Bosnian Serb, quote, "The Bosnian Muslim, no less than you, is sacred. It is wrong for you to rape her." If sacred is meant in the subjective sense, the Bosnian Serb can reply, "Sacred to you and yours, perhaps, not to me and mine. In the scheme of things, we happen not to attach much value to her life." End quote. And then to make the point even clearer, Perry says, by contrast, sacred in the objective sense is not fundamentally a matter of sacred to you or sacred to me. It is a matter of how things really are. If every human being is sacred in the objective sense, then in violating the Bosnian Muslim, the Bosnian Serb does not merely violate what some of us attach great value to, he violates the very order of creation. That is the religious, you see what I'm saying, the religious mindset, the religious position. And so the debate goes. I applaud Ronald Dworkin's project of attempting to preserve the idea of the sacred for people like us, because he is also trying to provide, again, a rationale for preserving human life, protecting it, and preserving human dignity, and not holding human beings cheaply, as he is doing, okay, for people like us, secularists, who most likely do not see evidence of a divine being in whose image we were created. For too long, non-believers have been tarred with the false accusation that if we do not believe in a supreme being, then we cannot be moral, or perhaps even have no compelling reason to protect the rights of others if they run afoul of our interests. Yet at the same time, in a logical sense, I understand the weaknesses of the elaborate architecture that Ronald Dworkin and other secularists erect when they attempt to create a commitment to the secular out of the sacred out of the secular world. It remains a challenging and difficult project, but for those who hold life precious and dear, I believe in a philosophical sense, it remains a very important project as well. But as I end this talk, I want to strengthen the secular position, relatively speaking, by emphasizing some of the weaknesses of those who believe in God and assert that only the religious can have a claim on the sacred. I usually don't do this. I mean, to weaken someone else's position doesn't necessarily strengthen your own. That's a type of fallacy, but I'm going to do that anyway, okay? Right? Because I think the traditional theistic position has a lot of unspoken weaknesses to it, okay, that puts people like us in a stronger, relatively speaking, stronger position with regard to the protection of human life and its sacredness. Well, in the first instance, this is obvious. In the first instance, if a person says that only if you believe in God can you conclude that human beings are sacred, then the problem that stares us in the face is that you first have to prove to the doubter or the humanist or the atheist that there is such a God. Okay, that's the big question. And this is a conversion that is seldom if ever achieved through rational argument or persuasion. In a pluralistic world wherein different people believe different things about ultimate reality, the conventionally religious person confronts a monumental practical obstacle. Okay? You first have to prove to someone or convince them that God exists before you can believe that God endows human beings with being the sacred. And that's very difficult. That almost never happens. It doesn't happen the other way around either. I mean, do you know what I'm saying? Atheists are not going to convince believers very readily through rational argument. Sometimes that happens, but not very often. A second and more interesting weakness, however, of those who affirm the sacred and what is sacred is defined by God, the creator and master of the universe, is that the concept of the sacred in the hard sense is not necessarily benign. This is something that religious thinkers almost always neglect to observe. You think of the word sacred, sacred means good, right? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. This is something readily, again, overlooked by those who believe in God and see their virtue as tagged to their belief in a supreme being. While the concept of the sacred in this hard sense may provide a sturdy foundation for bolstering respect for the person, it readily can and has done exactly the opposite. What I'm getting at is that the idea of the sacred emanating from God has been used to inspire the most wicked and evil cruelties human beings have inflicted on each other. One can readily conclude that the perpetrators of the Inquisition, the Holy Inquisition, the Crusades, the wars of the Protestant Reformation, all thought that they were acting in accord with God's sacred purpose. And you can bet your bottom dollar that Osama bin Laden got his sacred marching orders from Allah above to hijack jetliners and fly them into office buildings. Okay? When the creator of the universe issues his sacred command, okay, the Almighty, there ain't no power on earth that's going to stand in the way of that, and it comes with a sacred, okay, imprimatur to it. Do you understand what I'm saying? The sacred can be used for very nefarious purposes. Okay, okay. Again, while the sacred in the hard sense may provide, okay, a foundation for the respect of the person, it can also do very evil things. In my opinion, the advantages of an idea of the sacred such as Dworkin's is that it is not so absolute. It has more flexibility to it and requires deliberation to apply it. And since it does not emanate from an all-powerful, all-knowing master of the universe, is therefore less prone to be employed for self-righteous and wicked purposes. It involves deliberation, it involves thought, it involves weighing context, and so on and so forth. But in the very final analysis, if we put aside our philosophical speculations, which I've indulged you in today, a powerful reason for respecting the dignity and the life of others is that we ourselves wish to be so respected. No one of us, I think, no human being wants to be the object of gratuitous pain or to have their dignity violated. And because I don't want it, and I'm a social creature, I can conclude readily that you don't want it either. And because you don't want to be the object of pain or violation is a very good reason to not violate you or inflict any pain on you, okay? And then beyond that, in a positive sense, I may and should be impelled to recognize your dignity and treat you with respect as the fellow human being you are. In the end, the recognition of human dignity, our sacredness, if you will, comes from our sense of the human, so to speak, to what I would call our fellow feeling, our sensitivities about the humanity of others. In other words, it all boils down to humanity in the end.